Hello. So I read some more books. I'm basically done all of them except for one. I have like 2 chapters left, so I'm going to put it in this list anyways. I read 4 books in the last, like 2, 3 weeks? No, three. I'm going to say 3 weeks. And they're actually some pretty good books this time. So the first one is The History of a Tragedy. It's Chernobyl. And I read this because I saw there was a series on Chernobyl and I decided, well, if I'm going to watch that series, I should probably at least read the book first. And I found that they're actually pretty similar, though the series made some things up. This was a great book. One of the things I really liked about this is it captured the politics of the USSR and how they were pretty dysfunctional in the sense that they weren't adaptive to the real world situation. So for example, in the beginning, right before the crisis happened, in the control room, there was a control grid manager in Kiev who said that we needed more energy from the plant. And so they were supposed to run this safety test, and then they got delayed because they needed more energy in Kiev. And then, like when it was delayed, they had a night shift staff that came on, and the night shift staff wasn't prepared to run this test. They never ran this test before, and eventually they poisoned the reactor. And when you poison the reactor, you're supposed to shut it down, but instead of shutting it down, they ramped it up, which was a big mistake. Another thing they did was they were late to involve the international community because, all this is because they wanted to save face, right? In the USSR, you always wanted to be the manager who was doing something correct or at least maintaining the status quo. You didn't want to be caught making a mistake. So just to save face, they also refused to involve the international community, even though the international community could detect levels of radiation that were specifically linked to the particular reactors that the USSR was using. And they just didn't involve them, and they lied to them, again, to save face. Or, for example, there was a May 1st parade that they threw, which they threw every year. And the reason why they threw it, even though the radiation was so high that it actually caused mothers to have stillborn babies, was because they didn't want people to panic, right? So they, again, saved face rather than actually raising the alarm bells because nobody wanted to take the blame or nobody wanted to cause a panic and admit like some kind of mistake. So the book does a really good job of capturing this kind of politics that happens inside the USSR. And even Gorbachev is quoted inside this book, but I also believe Gorbachev in his memoirs said that the collapse of the USSR could probably be connected to the Chernobyl. Like that's probably the beginning signs of everything starting to break down. Another thing worth mentioning about this book is that it reads very neatly. Like the timeline unfolds in a very neat way to the point where you get the sense that it is artificial, but it makes the events so much more palatable and understandable, and it keeps you emotionally engaged with the events because it seems like it's following a story arc with this huge climax in the middle and then a slow descent to the end and some interesting things that happen in the beginning that kind of hint at a catastrophe that's about to happen. It's looming over you, right? The author does a really great job of this, and I was shocked. I have a lot of his books, and this probably is one of his best written books I've read so far. I haven't read all of his books, but I've read, I think, 3 or 4. I think he has like 9 or 10 books. I didn't realize how many he had. He also has one on Fukushima as well. So this is a highly, highly recommended book for me, even if you only have a tangential interest in USSR history or, let's say, nuclear policy. I would highly recommend reading this book. The next book is The Analects by Confucius, and this was part of a reading journey for me into Eastern philosophy. When I say Eastern, I don't just mean like Buddhism. It's also Chinese philosophy, even modern Chinese philosophy, modern Indian philosophy, things like this, right? But this is a classic, so I had to read it. And I will say there are some pros and cons. I feel like the book is a lot more hyped than it is good because it reads, like here's one of the downfalls, is it reads like shower thoughts some of the time. Some of the time it reads like shower thoughts, but then every once in a while he says something that's really interesting. Now, the good things about this book, I mean, this book in particular has a lot of annotation by a Confucius scholar, which is great. I recommend this version. She has a lot to say about Confucius. So I recommend this version. But the other thing that's great about this book, just not this particular version, but the Analects in general, is that there are some interesting ideas, right? So one of them can be, for example, Confucius didn't like people who would socialize with others in like a nice, kind way, and then have like nefarious or ill intent towards them behind closed doors, like when they're not in front of him. He thought that that was a little bit shameful. So like being a snake is kind of shameful. Another thing that he mentioned is his notion of tradition. A lot of people accuse him of having this rigid sense of tradition where it's unchanging no matter what. But he gives this story where if you go to, let's say, like he talks about how people will go to like a ceremony and they used to wear a particular type of clothing, but the clothing was too hot and too warm, and they eventually changed it to silk. And he said, well, silk is more practical to make and it's more breathable. So I understand we can change that tradition. But he says, when you go to this one altar that people will go to, they used to bow at the bottom of the stairs. Eventually, the tradition changed to bowing at the top of the stairs. But he didn't see any usefulness to changing to the being at the top of the stairs. And in fact, he saw a sense of arrogance that you should bow when you're on the same level as the gods as opposed to beneath them. So that would be a tradition where he wouldn't change. So he provides this useful distinction on when traditions should be changed or shouldn't be changed. And they're actually, it's based on practicality or utility, which people usually accuse traditionalists of not being practical. So I think that's also interesting as well. Now, he also talks a lot about education and learning. And one of the things he says in regards to this is that it's not enough to have virtues alone. Like, you should be a virtuous person. You should be kind, caring. You should have humaneness about you. But you need to be educated in order to reach what he called like a higher standard. Or sometimes I think he would say the gentlemanly standard or like outcome. But basically, to be like a higher version of yourself, you have to do education. Virtues are not enough, which I guess is not super original, but not a lot of people say that. Usually people will say that education is a virtue or something like this, but he seems to think that they're different. And he also is very big on not congratulating yourself for the competencies that you have, but instead being critical of the mistakes that you make and only focusing on your mistakes. So that's a bit interesting as well. Yeah, there are some good ideas in here overall, but there are also a lot of ideas in here where it's very low-hanging and it reads like a shower thought at best. The next book is Maps of Meaning by Peterson. So the downfall of this book, and it's a big downfall, and I wouldn't actually recommend reading this book unless you're willing to tolerate this downfall. He repeats himself a lot. And I don't think he's aware that he's repeating himself a lot because he spews out very similar to near identical ideas in a completely different set of word salads. He uses different concepts throughout different chapters, but the concepts are kind of the same. You can imagine, like, the best example maybe I could give of it is talking about the ocean and then talking about salt water. Like, maybe that would be like a good example where the phonemes are different, like the morphology of the words are different, but the semantics are almost near identical. There might be some slight differences, and he does that a lot. And so for that reason, the book comes off as super repetitive. Now, on the other side is that it is a slightly interesting worldview that Peterson has. So he thinks, for example, there is a distinction between the world of objects and the world of meaning, which is, I guess you could say it's like Neoplatonic, except his world of meaning has things like narratives into them. There's meaning, narrative, and archetypes. There's a bunch of like abstract things that relate to how to structure your life, which is quite interesting. He also talks about the known and unknown, so chaos and order. And he relates those back to like behaviors. So he thinks, for example, behavior in general is a manifestation of order because it is a way of interacting with an environment in a known way. And that's usually what behavior is meant to do, right? Sometimes we call them habits. Like, makes the environment familiar to you. Or another one might be like anxiety is a manifestation of the unknown, and we get anxiety when we're running into the unknown, and they're going to be baked into one another all the time. And then he also talks about I think what he calls it, but there's the mediator, the realm of the mediator, or something like this, where you have like things like the hero myth. And the hero myth is a conjunction of something that's in the realm of narrative or like abstraction that comes with a set of behaviors that are culturally governed or determined, and it makes the unknown more predictable, if that makes sense. I mean, it makes sense in the terms of Peterson's worldview. So that stuff was quite interesting, and that is like I'll say the first 3 chapters, which another thing about this book is the chapters are completely asymmetrical. So you need to be prepared to read a 100-page chapter and then a 10-page chapter, which I didn't like that, especially because there weren't a lot of breaks in between. Yeah, if you're into like Peterson's worldview and you want to deal with a lot of repetition with, like he's not as incomprehensible as Hegel or Sartre, but he's getting there. Like I said he's like Foucault. Foucault is sometimes incomprehensible. Peterson is also sometimes incomprehensible, but once you get used to it, you can kind of understand the prose and what he means and some of the concepts. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend this unless you really want to read a Peterson book. Like, this is probably the book you should read on Peterson as well, because it explains his background metaphysics. Now, this last book, Madness Explained by Richard P. Bentall, I love this book. There are a few books that I come across every once in a while in my life, like The Dark History, Oil, Power, and War, The Dark History. This is maybe one of them. The History of Money might be another one. The History of Western Philosophy, not by Bertrand Russell, it's a completely different book. But there are a few books that I always come across every once in a while in my life where like, this is a book that must be read because it's so original, it's very robust, like it's well-researched, it's not a short book, and you definitely have to read it, right? Like if you're gonna be, I wanna make like a list of these books in some point in my life to share with everybody. Another one is The Social Construction of Reality by John Searle. That was a fantastic book. This is also one of those books. Now, you might be familiar with some of the ideas in here. Like if you read into like hallucination research, it talks a lot about the stuff that goes on in there, and I was very familiar with those sections. If you're familiar with the theories of schizophrenia, like what kind of deficits are associated with them, especially the cognitive deficits, you'll be familiar with that. But what's really interesting about this book is his rejection. And I'm someone who studied clinical psychology in a university setting, and I've been reading clinical psychology for like 15 years now. He rejects the DSM approach, or the ICD approach, to diagnoses. Or at least he doesn't want to use it as a way to treat people. It's really hard to, without having the direct quotes, represent his view fairly, but the general idea here is that what he wants to do is look at symptoms and manage symptoms. Because he talks about, for example, there's overlap between the symptoms of bipolar and schizophrenia, and sometimes those symptoms are not equally strong in different members of the schizophrenia category, different members of the bipolar category. So you could have someone who has bipolar and they suffer a lot from visual hallucination, and you can have someone who's schizophrenic and they suffer a lot from visual hallucination. And the question becomes, do you put them in schizophrenia or bipolar? There's also examples where you could get psychologists in France and psychologists or psychiatrists, clinical professionals in different countries, give them the same symptoms, same cases, and they'll diagnose people completely differently. So this also happens. So there's an issue of reliability with diagnosis. And he thinks, look, we don't need to say that like negative affect and like negative expectation or like pessimistic outlook in the world is linked to depression and we treat depression. We don't even need to do that. We could just say what works best for people who look at the world negatively or like excessively negatively, and what works best for people who have mania. We don't need to treat bipolar or schizophrenia. We need to treat the symptom. And the symptom is reliably categorized by everybody, right? Because it's self-evident. It manifests on its own. And maybe what can happen is like, and I feel like this is where he gets a little bit weird towards the end of the book, is people come up with different models for the symptoms. And those models don't have replicability always between different studies. And so I feel like once he started getting, towards the end of the book, when he started giving out his own theories, maybe you could say it's a little bit of academic narcissism, which is fine. It makes things exciting. He gets back into this territory where he's trying to treat a construct, such as like depression or whatever. But instead of that, it's like he's trying to say that the symptoms can only be measured by that particular construct. And I feel like you don't need the construct. A lot of this happens, by the way, when it comes to language. Like them trying to model different types of language because he's going into this thing about R.D. Laing and how Laing said that when schizophrenics communicated, it's not that their speech was incomprehensible, it's that you didn't understand the meaning. And so people tried to then categorize the different types of speech that were associated with schizophrenia or pathology in general. And I feel like that got too much away from the philosophy of treat the symptom rather than the construct. Yeah. I feel like that was a bit of a drawback towards the book, but overall, it's a great book, really well researched. He has a ton of data in here, and the ideas are very, very interesting and controversial, which makes for a fantastic book. Even if you don't agree with him, right? Maybe you do like the idea of depression, but he said, for example, that the idea of depression might have outlived its usefulness. So I highly recommend reading this book. I have like maybe 1 or 2 chapters left, page 450 out of like 500 and something. Yeah, read this book. So those were some of my recent reads. I want to try doing this other thing where I have like 50 or 60 philosophy books that I have. I'm currently editing my first book. I'm rewriting my first book, the Knowing Nothing book, because the table of contents is all scuffed. And I've been editing it, and I've written a few more chapters that I've put into it, made it a longer book. And so I want to do this thing where I just read 100 philosophy books, and I'm done with philosophy for at least like 10 years, because I've been reading philosophy since I was like 13. I'm now 30 something, right? It's been a long time, and I just want to I'm done with it, right? So I'll read like 100 foundational books inside philosophy and be done with it for 10 years. So if you guys have any great like core books that I should read, that would be good. And I don't want like generalized books where it's like maybe the Oxford Handbook of Epistemology, right? Like I have some of those and I'll read those. And maybe some journals like the Contemporary Reading Some Philosophy of Mind by David Chalmers. But I would prefer primary sources like History, Truth, and Reason by Hilary Putnam or Consciousness Explained by Daniel Dennett. These really, really robust primary sources in philosophy that are highly cited. If you guys know books like this, I know Derek Prophet's Reasons and Persons is another one. If you know books like this, I would love to see them because I have about 50 or 60 books already established here. And the next 50 or 40 books, if you have any suggestions, I'm open to them. And with that being said, bye-bye till next time.